What's up everyone? Welcome back to Super Carmio. In today's episode we're going to be starting off the Miata Turbo Build by installing one of the most essential tuning tools, the wideband oxygen sensor. So before we get started with the install, I just want to break down what an oxygen sensor is, as well as remark on the differences between a narrowband and wideband oxygen sensor. Let's get to it. Alright guys, so here's a basic diagram of a exhaust manifold feeding into a collector with an O2 sensor before the cat, a cat, and then a post-cat O2 sensor. So the first O2 sensor before the cat, its job is basically to measure the oxygen content of the exhaust gases that are flowing through here, while the post-cat is basically measuring the efficiency of the cat. So we're not really concerned with this side. Alright, so with that diagram out of the way, let's talk about how an oxygen sensor actually works. So it's calibrated to read all the oxygen particles around it in free air. It actually has other uses besides cars, such as for scuba diving and whatnot. But for car purposes, it's basically going to calculate the difference between the free air, so outside air, and then the oxygen content inside of the exhaust gases that are passing through it. Now, the calculation that it's making is basically how many parts air to fuel. So you'll probably see a number a lot, which is 14.7, which is called stoic. So that's basically 14.7 parts air to 1 part fuel. And that's considered the optimal combustion event. This usually occurs during like cruise or idle. It's really good for emissions basically, and just a clean burn event. However, when you're going into higher RPM or into boost, this number gets smaller, so there's going to be less air and more fuel. It'll drop to around 13 or so during high load conditions for naturally aspirated cars. For turboed cars, it'll drop even lower, sometimes in the mid 11s or so. You basically want that extra fuel to cool down the combustion. So the next thing we want to talk about is narrowband versus wideband. So narrowband is pretty much what the factory cars will have, and it reads from about 0 to 1 volts. And it's basically just indicating lean or not. And then wideband is commonly from 0 to 5 volts, and this will give you a way broader range. So from, let's say, about 10 points AFR to all the way to 22.4. So it'll basically cover the whole range of values. So for OEM cars, basically a narrowband sensor, all it's telling the car is, hey, inject more fuel or inject less so that I could reach this number right here during closed loop operation. Now to reach this number, basically there's what we call a short-term fuel trim, and that's where the oxygen sensor basically has the authority to inject or subtract fuel, usually around 25%, just to hit this number. And then this short-term fuel trim, if it accumulates over time, will basically build into long-term fuel trim. And this basically account for the car's wear and tear, as well as sensors breaking down over time. So this basically will allow cars to still meet this 14.7 number for emissions, even after the injectors start clogging up, the fuel pump starts degrading, and so forth. So we'll need a wideband oxygen sensor because we need the range to basically measure our entire engine's operating parameters. So from idle all the way to high RPM, we want to see how many parts air to fuel we're hitting. That way we can ensure that our car's tune is safe and reliable. Alright, so this is where we stand. We have the Innovate plug right here, and then the stock O2 sensor plug right there, and that beautiful grommet right here that we installed the other week for the water temperature gauge. Unfortunately, we're going to have to yank it because this Innovate plug is pretty big, so this is connecting to the gauge itself. We're going to have to feed that through that grommet. Then we'll just clip the connector in. Now we'll just zip tie it to secure it in place. Alright, next we'll take off the center console. You guys should be pros at this by now. Alright, so if you guys remember from the coolant gauge install, we ran a 12 volt power source to the gauge, so we're just going to do that again right over here, and then also we're going to run a ground wire. However, this time we're going to ground it to the engine block somewhere on the head area. With the wideband, it's really important that the ground shares the same ground as the ECU. You want the cleanest signal possible. Alright, so for the connections besides power, we have white and black, which will be tied to ground, and then brown is our narrowband output, yellow is our wideband output, and then this is the connector that goes to the oxygen sensor itself. Alright, so as you can see, we utilized the plug that came off the stock O2 sensor, and we're basically not going to use any of these heater wires or this gray wire. We're just going to use this black connection, which is the signal output from the wideband. So the brown wire is effectively connected to this black pin on the stock plug. So that'll give the ECU a narrowband output. Last thing we'll have to do is just connect this ground right here. What's up guys? So it's the next day, and before we try starting the car and checking out the oxygen sensor reading, we're actually going to do calibration. The calibration is important because the way that this sensor works is it's basically comparing the outside oxygen content, so the oxygen content in your current atmosphere versus the oxygen content inside your exhaust stream. So when you do calibration, it's going to have to be outside of your exhaust. With that out of the way, let's calibrate it and then try it out. And that's what your oxygen sensor should look like. It's just hanging outside of the exhaust stream. Okay, now that we're in the car, we're just going to disconnect the sensor from the gauge. And now with the gauge disconnected, we're just going to turn the car to ignition. And what you'll see on the gauge is the E2, which is basically error code for a wideband without the sensor. So as you can see, there's our error code, and we're just going to leave it here for about 30 seconds. Alright, 30 seconds later, we're going to switch the car back off, and then we'll reconnect the sensor to the gauge. And now this time when we switch the car to ignition, we're going to see the gauge display CAL, or calibration, after it heats up, of course. Alright, and then after it calibrates, you'll see the open air reading, which is basically the max value of the gauge, 22.4. Alright, now we can go back and reinstall it. Alright, so now that the sensor is calibrated, everything's connected. So let's turn on the car and see what kind of reading we get. So as you guys could see, we have successfully wired in a wideband. Towards the end of the previous clip, the car was in closed loop operation, or where the car is trying to achieve a perfect stoic combustion at 14.7 parts air to fuel. Now the cool thing about having a wideband is you'll always have insight into how your car is running. So for example, when it was warming up, we noticed that the gauge was reading a lot richer, and that's just because of the natural fact that when an engine is cold, it's going to need more fuel to run in a stable fashion. It will also be helpful to identify potential issues such as an exhaust leak where the gauge will read lean just because there's air entering the exhaust system. So overall, you're going to need a wideband for tune-in, but also to see how your car is running and identify potential issues. Alright, let's get back in the cabin and button everything up. Alright, now I just have to clean up these wires, and as you can see, I left one extra wire right here, and that's actually connected to the yellow output. So when the time comes, I'm just going to switch that signal wire right here from the brown wire to this yellow wire. That way I'll get the full wideband reading. Alright guys, we're on the way to turboing the Miata, one step at a time, right? So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. Press that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace out.
Chuki Beats. Damn, they got fire.